Hi everybody, I'm Sarah, the Real Simple Mama, and in my little series of type 1 juvenile diabetes videos, this is going to be the story about how our journey was while we were in the hospital. Thank you for being here and for watching this video. Again, my disclaimers really quickly are that I'm not a medical professional. I never have been and never will be. So please use my experiences, my stories, my suggestions as a starting point to help get you thinking about different perspectives, but please never change anything without consulting your child's doctors first. My other disclaimer is that if I happen to mention something that I use or that I like, whether it's a product or an app or a group or anything like that, please know that I'm not paid or compensated by anybody. Those are just my honest opinions on what works for our family. So this video, like I mentioned, is going to just tell you about our experience being in the hospital when my son was first diagnosed with type 1 juvenile diabetes. We've been out of the hospital for about 2 weeks, and we were there for 5 days. Now, this is not a review of the hospital, and their food was pretty good, but the rooms were kind of small. I'm not going to give you any specifics as far as what the hospital was or the nurses' names or anything like that. It's not a review. It's just in case you or a loved one is in the hospital with a child who's been diagnosed, or you are the grown-up who's there with a child, or you feel like that may be where you're headed, then this is just to kind of help you experience it through somebody else so that maybe some things will be a little bit less scary and less new if that ever happens to you. Feel free, of course, to email me if you have any questions or suggestions or you'd like clarification, or of course you can also comment on this video. Finally, before I get started, if you haven't seen our diagnosis story, you could check out that video right up here. That's going to tell you about the symptoms that we had noticed and basically what ended up getting us to the hospital. So my son was diagnosed on Friday, January 22nd, and I was the grown-up who went with him. And our on-call pediatrician sent us directly to an actual pediatric emergency hospital. So not like an urgent care or anything like that, but the actual hospital. And we showed up there at about 9 o'clock on a Friday night. And so again, I'm going to just sort of catalog for you what the experience was like, what happened to us, some little tips and things to be aware of, but mostly this video is just going to be about our experience. So when we got there, the on-call pediatrician had already informed the hospital that we were on our way. So triage and everything was ready for us. Of course, there are some extra complications in place because right now we are dealing with the pandemic. And so luckily we didn't have to wait. We were able to go right in and get seen. And a few things happened pretty quickly. Now, my son was able to walk himself in. He was, of course, sleepy. We had woken him up after bedtime, and he didn't feel great, but he wasn't comatose or anything like that. He was alert and aware. So they got us into one of the small little ER rooms. They took us back. They did all the vital things, but pretty quickly, a few things became very apparent to the staff, to the nurses, and that was that he was a diabetic who, of course, up until this point had not been treated, and he had ketoacidosis. And I'll do another video where I explain more of like what the heck are ketones and ketoacidosis. But really briefly, it's basically when your blood sugar levels are really super high, like they've been over 300 for a little while, and your body has no sugar to use for energy, so it starts to use fat instead. And it ends up causing your blood to become really acidic because your body's not burning what it's supposed to do. And so you end up with acid that can end up being poisonous in your blood. And ketoacidosis just means that those ketones, those levels in your blood have become really dangerous, and it can get really, really dangerous. So they did a couple of things pretty quickly. We did a finger poke to check and see what his levels were. And again, 300 is pretty high. My son was at 619. And they did a COVID test on him, which I'll be honest, the COVID test for my son was the worst part of the entire hospital stay. Having that stick shoved up your nose and all of that, it was terrible. Luckily, we were confident that we were negative. We've been quarantining really strictly, and he was negative. And they put a catheter in his arm. And this is not the technical medical term, but it was one of those plastic bendy catheters. So it wasn't like a metal needle being in his arm, but that was something in his arm so that they could do blood. And then we confirmed the ketoacidosis and the ketones by having him go pee in a cup. And then they were able to use the ketone test in order to confirm what they had already suspected. So we did see the ER doctor down there, the doctor who was on the floor for the night, but you know, it was clear that they were going to have to admit us for the night, and so we stayed down in the ER for probably about 3 hours before they had a room ready for us to move up to the pediatric ICU. And again, at that point, we weren't really sleeping. We were kind of just hanging out in this little room. We tried to watch TV. We we got to meet with the financial department, which I feel bad for those people because I know they're doing their job, but you're dealing with a distraught mother in the middle of the night. And so that was not a fun experience. And otherwise, we were just kind of hanging out. And so eventually they moved us upstairs into the pediatric ICU. And by the pediatric intensive care unit, or ICU, we're talking about you need to be monitored a bit more closely. So there were a whole bunch of precautions in place. They had 3 chest monitors put on my son, the little sticky pads that read vitals and that kind of thing. And they had the little oxygen meter, the little clip on his finger, and he wore a blood pressure cuff. And so he just looked pretty pitiful, pretty tragic laying in that bed. So we got up into the pediatric ICU and we were there for about 2 days. Now, the initial concern in our case, and unfortunately or fortunately, most of the juvenile diabetic diagnosis stories that my husband and I have been reading the past few weeks, and we've read hundreds, this is really, really common. Suddenly your kid gets really sick, you can't figure anything out, and this is what it ends up being. And it's untreated diabetes and ketoacidosis. And then what ended up happening is they had the monitors and everything on him, and they started him on saline, because what we're trying to do is clean his blood, flush his blood, flush all that stuff out. And they did not start with insulin right away. And the ketoacidosis aspect of his diagnosis, I think he was in the clear in his case after about 10 or 12 hours. So in his little catheter in his arm, he was constantly getting saline. And then after a while, they did start him on, I believe, 2 types of insulin. Of course, at that point, I didn't know anything about any of the terms of insulin or fast acting or long acting or Lantus or Novolog or anything. But I believe they started him on a little bit of both. So we were there in the pediatric ICU. Again, in the ICU, you need more monitoring. So we had nurses come in at least every 2 or 3 hours, day and night, to do everything from checking his finger pokes to measuring how much he peed. He had to pee in a special jug that was variegated. You know, it had the measurements on it so that we could see if he was peeing enough, considering the amount of liquid that they knew that he was putting in his body. We had to order from the cafeteria, but we had to get a quick lesson on carb counting, and everything was just, I mean, you're dealing with your heart, you know, that's sitting there in this hospital bed. And it was extremely difficult. This was out of the blue. It was unexpected. And now we're having to learn about this lifelong disease. So the goals that we learned is that just like down in the ER, the pediatric ICU doctor on the floor would come and visit us once a day and just kind of say, hey, and answer some questions, but they're not the expert on diabetes. So we had an endocrinologist who came and met with us. And I'll tell you that I will do some extra, I'm going to do separate videos on all of these different topics that we're talking about. But one thing I'll suggest if you're watching this is to record or take notes or tape or do something to remember everything that's told to you, especially in those first few appointments. I ended up just by coincidence throwing my notebook that has my to-do lists and lists of videos I want to write and articles and all of that stuff. I threw it in my purse, and that notebook is almost completely full with all of the notes from the endocrinologist and the nurses and everything. So when we got to meet with the endocrinologist, let's see, we went to the ER on Friday night, and I guess it was Sunday morning when we got to meet with the endocrinologist. That meeting was about 85 minutes long. Again, because of the pandemic, my husband and daughter were not allowed to be there. And so we FaceTimed my husband in to this live meeting, and then I also recorded it on another device. So I have an 85-minute video just in case I want to go back and reference anything. And it was extremely helpful because, again, you're in shock, you're sleep deprived. This is all just new and crazy, and you might be writing down thing A and the endocrinologist is already on C. So you don't want to miss any content. There were a lot of other crazy things that we had to learn about. There were nurses. Again, one of the problems with being in just a regular hospital that's not a specialty hospital is that the nurses and the doctors who are there aren't exactly experts on any one thing, right? They have to be just masters of everything. So we did have a couple of nurses who were honorary diabetic nurses. They themselves were not diabetic, but they knew a lot and they were really, really good. And they were also really instrumental. So another thing that would be helpful is to try to keep track of the nurses and the staff that you really bond with, who are just really great above and beyond, because you can send things to be delivered and put the nurses department and their name on it. And we plan to do that this next week. So take care of the nurses. They're wonderful. Another big challenge for us was learning about the carb counting. And so with the cafeteria for the hospital, we got the menu that said this entree is this many carbs, these sides are this many carbs. And while my son was able to order what he wanted, we did have to keep track of how many carbs it was. And in the beginning, it was really stressful because we ordered and knew how many carbs were on that full plate, but he wasn't eating it all. And so the first few meals, we actually chose to not give him his insulin, the fast-acting insulin, to correct those carbs until after he had eaten. Now, that's not ideal at home, but in the beginning, you're like, I don't know how much my kid is going to eat. This is different food. I don't know if he's going to like it. And so we chose to, okay, he's got 48 carbs on his plate. Let's wait though and see when he eats, and let him eat for 15-20 minutes, then cut him off and see how many carbs he actually ate, and then dose him based on that. So we were learning how to do that. My son liked looking at the menu and kind of adding up the different carbs and things like that. It also helped that for most of the nights that we were there, he had a very similar dinner. He didn't order completely different things every night. So that was another variable that we sort of eliminated by saying, no, we're going to order pretty much the same dinner. Now, I'll say if you are the grown-up who is there with a child, if you are in a pediatric unit of the hospital, chances are they will have a cafeteria that will do 3 meals for your child, but it doesn't include snacks or anything in the middle of the night and stuff like that. And it also doesn't include anything for the grown-up or the guardian who is there. So you're going to be on your own. And I bring this up because one of the reasons why I want to do these videos and these articles is to connect with other parents who are in the same boat, because it is so very isolating and so very sad and tragic. And if you are the guardian who is there with your kid in the moment, whether you're a single parent or you're the partner who went, or, whatever your situation may be, if you're like me and you are the one who is at the hospital with your child, you need to take care of yourself too. I know everybody gets to grieve and experience this in a different way. And in no way am I saying, one way of dealing with it is better than the other. But if you are the grown-up who is there, I would strongly encourage you, if you're the one around the child, to be calm and positive as much as possible. You are going to need to have a freak out moment. You are going to need to scream and cry about this terrible, life-changing condition. And it's going to end up being okay, but it is definitely a shock when it first happens. So just know that while you are trying to hold it together in every sense of the word and be strong, and my words were be calm and be positive, be calm and be positive. And I'll also do a video of all the different analogies that I used for my kid when we were learning what diabetes is, and just thinking of visualizations and analogies to how to explain it, either to little brother and little sister at home, or the best friends, or other families, or whatever the case may be. I'll do a short video where I just describe, this is how I explained it to my son in ways that he could understand. But you are going to need to deal with it eventually. But while you are the one who is there, as much as you can, try to be calm and positive. Just learn as much as you can. But then you also need to take care of yourself too. I will admit that I'm doing a very strict diet and workout challenge right now. And I was doing it when I went to the hospital with my son, not knowing we were going to be there for 5 days. And my husband is wonderful, and he was trying to bring up my special diet, but we didn't have a fridge or a microwave, and that food was going bad. And so I survived on water and cold brew, black coffee, and protein shakes. And I know I was getting malnourished. I felt terrible, but I finally realized at 3 o'clock in the morning, one of those nights when I was just extremely weak and thought I was going to pass out on the toilet, basically, I thought, I'm not doing my son any favors by not taking care of myself. Now, we're not talking hashtag self-care and you deserve a bubble bath and a pedicure. And it's not about those things. But if you deprive yourself of just eating and trying to get a little bit of sleep or taking shifts whenever possible, you're not helping take care of your child. And I say that with love, and I say that to past me, because I wasn't taking care of myself. And I thought, how am I helping my kid if I pass out on the floor? How am I helping my kid if I can't focus on what the nurses are doing? So just keep that in mind. And I say that with love, because I needed to hear that, and I didn't take care of myself when I was in the hospital. And I'm still recuperating from that, physically and emotionally and all the things. Okay, so being in the pediatric ICU, again, you're going to be watched and monitored a lot more closely. So we were dealing with the carb counting and watching his numbers kind of go all over the place, learning what is a low for him and what is a high for him and all of that kind of thing. And when we got permission by the doctor on the floor to move to the pediatric hospital unit, which is not the ICU, it was wonderful. And so my son was able to be detached from the little finger oxygen monitor, from the blood pressure cuff, and then he had the pads still on his chest, the catheter still in his arm, but they unhooked it all. So it was just the sticky pads on his chest, and it was just a catheter not plugged into anything. They ended up keeping those things on my son's body for the entirety of our hospital stay, just in case. But it was great to graduate to the pediatric unit. There was, instead of me just having a hard couch to sleep on, and the poor hospitals, I mean, they try their best for the guardians, but we know, it's not home. It's nothing like it. And we had a little pull-out sofa, and my son didn't have to sleep in the hospital bed. So he and I actually slept together under the window. And we got our own bathroom that had a bathtub and a shower in it. So we were able to shower for the first time in 4 days. And you get a little bit more freedom as far as you're not hooked up to a ton of stuff. You're able to walk around the floor. So that was very liberating, and it felt absolutely wonderful. We still had staff that was just really incredible. But the goal, once we moved to the pediatric unit, you're like, I want to go home, right? For us, the things that needed to happen in my mind were two big goals. The first goal is we need to figure out what our son's healthy levels are. Like, we don't want him to go below X. We don't want him to go above Y. So figuring out where his healthy parameters are and getting him stable, so we're not doing like this craziness, but getting him to where the lines are a lot more stable like that. And the other thing is that we wanted, before us to graduate and to go home, we had to get everything from the pharmacy brought up to the hospital, which my husband had to deal with. And I had to prove that I could take care of my son on my own. So I had to start doing all of the finger pokes. I had to start doing the calculating and the actual dosing of the shot in his arm with nurse supervision. So obviously they're still involved. They kept the insulin and would bring in, and they would watch me, and they'd have another staff member check. So there were 3 adults who were checking on every dose. But of course, when we go home, it can't be like, oh, wait, I don't know what I'm doing. So for us to be able to go home, for the endocrinologist to sign off and say, yes, you can discharge them, we had to prove that we could do it on our own. So those were the two things. For us, what was really frustrating is that we couldn't get his levels stable overnight, which is weird in a way because he's not eating for like 10 or 12 hours. And our endocrinologist personally felt that part of the problem was that the cafeteria delivered meals on a really inconsistent schedule. So there's another tip for you. Get the hospital cafeteria. If your son or your child is in the hospital, they need to deliver food on time. So not, oh, breakfast is at 7 a.m. one day and 8:30 a.m. the next, because that screws you up for the whole day. We had dinner served one day like at 4:45 or 5 o'clock, and another day it was like 7:30 at night, like just ridiculous. So as much as you can, get your nurses to advocate for you and to try to help. And that's one thing that made us love one of our nurses, who was just a fierce warrior, is that she would fight for us and be like, what, like, he needs to eat. He's diabetic. Like, we need his food up here, like right now. Instead of delivering his tray last on the entire floor, it's like, you guys are late, let's go. So keep that in mind as well. And so we continued to talk to the endocrinologist constantly. We still text her every day with questions, and that's totally okay. And I don't want you to feel like, well, I don't want to be the parent or the guardian who's being annoying and who's asking too many questions. This is the health of your child, and the fact that you care and you're worrying means that you're doing a great job. But if there's a question and you feel like you need to ask your medical professional, please don't hesitate to ask. All right, so we got to Tuesday and we were praying that we were going to be able to go home. Of course, the discharge process does take a long time, and he had to get all of the monitors and the catheter out of his arm and all of that stuff off of him. But we were finally able to go home on Tuesday when we had proven that we were able to dose successfully, or we kind of had a plan as far as all of the ratios, all of the parameters for his long-acting insulin and what we were going to do with that, as well as how we adjust for carbs. Then we were able to go home. A few other notes really quickly here at the end. If you guys also, if you have suggestions for videos or you'd like more information, you'd like me to write an article, I've got a huge list, of course, but you're always welcome to either email me or suggest it in the comments. But we knew that because our son had ketoacidosis and had been untreated for a while as far as being a diabetic, that it's going to take at least 3 weeks for him to look and feel like he was before all of those beginning symptoms showed up. So for example, we're almost on week 3. We're just a few days shy of being 3 weeks out, and he is still ravenously hungry all the time. That's okay. It's not always going to be that way. So that was one thing. The next thing is to be posting stuff up in your house as far as all of the parameters. We do this pen at this time, this dose at this time. All of those things will really help. And then, like I said, don't be afraid to contact your endocrinologist with questions. We've changed my son's parameters, I don't even know how many times, almost once a day. Something or another is changed. And so just the fact that you're trying to pay attention and you care is really meaningful, and it will really make a difference in your child recovering. So it may take a full 6 months before your child, before their hair starts being thick and shiny again, and their skin tone looks right, and they've gained back potential weight that they've lost. But just take it one day at a time, and I mean that in every sense of the word. Make sure that you take care of yourself emotionally. It took me a good week and a half before I was able to come home and release that I'm not the only guardian taking care of my child. I can have a break. I have help now. I can relax a little bit. For me to just sob hysterically and scream and cry and hate everybody and everything and question God and, why wasn't it me instead? And, all of those things. But it took me a while to be able to open up and let down my guard because I wasn't the one in the hospital with my kid anymore, to where I could emotionally get some of that stuff out and start to cope with it. So I will have a lot more videos coming up, but I wanted to give you just some insight into what our hospital stay was like. And I hope that this has been helpful to somebody. I appreciate you subscribing or commenting if this is something that has helped you, or if there's anything else I can do. Thanks.